The stars had never seemed so cold to Admiral Elena Vasquez as she stood on the bridge of the Un's Defiance, watching the endless black void through the viewport that stretched before her like a canvas of ancient light and distant death. 60 years ago, humanity had reached beyond their tiny blue world and found they were not alone in the universe. And what they discovered changed everything they believed about their place among the stars. For the galaxy was full of life ancient, civilizations that had traveled between worlds for thousands of years before humans even learned to make fire. The Galactic Concord welcomed humanity with open arms, or so it seemed at the time. And 12 species stood united against a common enemy that threatened them all, the Vorath Dominion, a ruthless empire that consumed world after world at the edge of known space, leaving nothing but ash and silence in their wake. Admiral Vasquez turned from the viewport and looked across her bridge, where men and women worked at their stations with the quiet efficiency that came from years of training and months of war. These were her people, her family, and she would die before she let them down. "Admiral," called Lieutenant Commander Sarah Park from the communication station. "The fleet assembly is complete. All ships report ready for jump coordinates to Kethris Prime." Vasquez nodded and felt the weight of command settle heavier on her shoulders. For this was it, the battle that would end the war. The decisive strike that would break the Vorath Dominion once and for all. And humanity had given everything to make this moment possible. She thought about what humanity had sacrificed over the past decades, and the numbers made her heart ache with pride and sorrow mixed together like wine and water. Humanity had contributed more ships than any other species in the Concord. More soldiers, more resources, more blood and tears and broken families. All because they believed in the alliance and the promise of peace. The Valari had founded the Concord 3,000 years ago. An elegant species with silver skin and eyes, like liquid gold who moved through the universe as if they owned it, and perhaps they did. For their technology was ancient, and their knowledge was vast. But their hearts had grown cold over the millennia. Then there were the Krethok, massive reptilian warriors who stood 8 feet tall and carried weapons forged in the volcanic fires of their homeworld. They respected only strength and viewed combat as a sacred art. Yet they had always looked at humans with something that resembled disgust hiding behind their yellow eyes. Both species tolerated humanity at best and despised them at worst, whispering in their councils about how these newcomers were too emotional, too aggressive, too short-lived to be trusted with important matters. Yet they were always happy to let human soldiers die on the front lines. Commander David Chun walked onto the bridge with a datapad clutched tight in his hands, and Vasquez noticed immediately that something was wrong. His face had gone pale, and his eyes held a shadow of fear that made her stomach clench. "Admiral, I need to speak with you privately," he said in a voice barely above a whisper as she followed him to her ready room and sealed the door behind them, watching as he paced back and forth like a caged animal trying to escape. "What is it?" "David, tell me what you found. I intercepted encrypted communications between Valori High Command and an unknown recipient," he said, his words tumbling out fast and desperate. "The encryption is unlike anything I have ever seen. But I caught fragments before my access was revoked, Admiral. Something is very wrong here." "What kind of fragments?" "Coordinates, fleet positions, deployment schedules, our deployment schedules, Elena. And they were being sent somewhere they should never go." Before Vasquez could respond, her communicator chirped with an urgent summons to the command deck. The jump was commencing in 10 minutes, and all flag officers were required at their stations immediately. "We will discuss this after the battle," she told Chun. But he grabbed her arm with desperate strength. "Admiral, please delay the jump." "Just a few hours so I can decode more of the transmission. I cannot delay a fleet of 4,000 warships based on fragments and suspicion." "David, but I promise you that the moment this battle is over, we will investigate together." She did not know then that her promise would never be kept. That some promises are broken not by those who make them, but by those who betray the very concept of trust. The fleet jumped to Kethris Prime in a cascade of light that split the darkness like the birth of new stars. And when they emerged, Vasquez felt her breath catch in her throat at the sight before her. The Vorath fleet was there, just as intelligence had predicted. But something was wrong. The numbers did not match. For instead of the expected 2,000 enemy vessels, she counted 6,000 at minimum. A wall of death that stretched across the starfield like a plague of metal and fire. "How is this possible?" she whispered, her mind racing to understand how their intelligence could have been so catastrophically wrong. And then she noticed something else. Something that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. The Volari fleet and the Krethake armada were not beside the human ships as planned. They had positioned themselves behind, cutting off any possible retreat. "Admiral," Park called out, her voice cracking with confusion. "I am receiving strange signals from the Allied vessels. Their weapon systems are charging. For one terrible moment." Elena Vasquez understood everything, and the truth hit her like a physical blow. The fragments Chun had found, the impossible enemy numbers, the strange positioning of their allies, it all made horrible, perfect sense. "All ships," she commanded, her voice steady even as her world crumbled. "Raise shields and prepare for combat on all fronts. We have been betrayed." The words had barely left her lips when the first Volori plasma bolt struck the hull of a human destroyer. And the Battle of Kethris Prime began not as a victory against an ancient enemy, but as a slaughter orchestrated by those who had called themselves friends. The universe exploded into chaos as fire bloomed across the void of space, and Admiral Elena Vasquez watched in horror as ships bearing the flags of trusted allies turned their weapons upon the vessels of humanity. The first human destroyer to die was the Un's Horizon, a ship crewed by 300 souls who had woken that morning believing they were going to fight for freedom and peace. They never even had time to scream before Volori plasma. Cannons tore through their hull and scattered their atoms across the cold emptiness of space. "Return fire on all hostile vessels," Vasquez commanded, her voice cutting through the screams and alarms that filled the bridge. "All ships form defensive formation around the carriers. We will not die without a fight." But even as she gave the order, she knew the truth that burned like acid in her heart. They were trapped between the Vorath in front and their former allies behind, caught in a crossfire designed to ensure that not a single human ship would survive this day. The battle raged with terrible fury as human captains fought with everything they had, pushing their ships beyond all safe limits, burning their engines hot enough to melt the reactor casings, firing weapons until the barrels glowed white with heat. Commander Chun appeared at her side, blood running down his face from a cut-eye's forehead, and his eyes held the terrible knowledge of a man who had been right when he desperately wished to be wrong. "I decoded the rest of the transmission," he said, shouting over the sound of explosions that rocked the ship. "The Volari made a deal with the Vorath. They agreed to sacrifice humanity in exchange for peace. They sold us to save themselves." Vasquez felt something break inside her chest. Not her body, but something deeper. The naive belief that honor and loyalty meant the same thing to all species in the galaxy. On the view screen, she watched the Un's Resolute take a direct hit from a Krethak missile barrage, the proud vessel splitting in half as atmosphere and bodies spilled into the vacuum. Captain Morrison had served with her for 20 years, and now he was gone, erased from existence by creatures who had stood beside him in war councils just days ago. "Admiral, we have lost 600 ships in the first 20 minutes, reported the tactical officer, his voice hollow with shock. "The Volori and Krethak are blocking all escape routes. They mean to kill every last one of us." The mathematics of death were simple and brutal. Humanity had brought 1,800 warships to this battle, and they were dying at a rate of 30 per minute. Caught between 6,000 Varth vessels and nearly 4,000 ships from their treacherous allies. "Get me a channel to Earth," Vasquez ordered. "Maximum power broadcast on all frequencies if we are going to die here. Then, humanity will know why." The communications officer worked frantically at her station, rerouting power from failing systems, and finally nodded with tears streaming down her face. "Channel open. Admiral broadcasting to all human colonies and Earth Command." Elena Vasquez stood straight, despite the deck shaking beneath her feet. Despite the fires burning at the edges of the bridge. Despite the knowledge that she had only minutes left to live. "This is Admiral Elena Vasquez of the UN's defiance to all human worlds." She spoke clearly into the void, knowing that billions of her people would hear these words. "We came here to fight for the Galactic Concord, to defend an alliance we believed in with all our hearts." An explosion knocked her sideways, but she grabbed the railing and kept speaking. "The Valari and Krethak have betrayed us. They made a secret pact with the Varth, Dominion, to sacrifice humanity in exchange for their own survival. And as I speak these words, they are slaughtering our fleet, murdering our sons and daughters, our brothers and sisters." The bridge was filling with smoke now, and she could feel the defiance dying around her. The great ship that had carried her through 100 battles finally succumbing to wounds too terrible to survive. "We have lost this battle, but we have not lost who we are. Remember that. My people, remember what we are. Remember that humanity does not break, does not surrender, does not forget." She paused as another impact shook the vessel, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the cold fury of a species that had been wounded beyond forgiveness. "They broke faith with us today, and the galaxy will learn what that means. To those who hear this message, know that I die proud to be human. Proud to stand with the brave men and women who fought beside me. Proud to be part of a species that never betrays those who trust them." The transmission cut out as the communications array was destroyed, and Vasquez looked around at her remaining crew, fewer than 50 people still alive on the ship that had carried 800. "It has been an honor," she said simply, and they nodded back at her with eyes that held no fear. Only the grim acceptance of soldiers who had given everything. The defiance lasted another 12 minutes, fighting until the very end, taking 17 enemy ships with her into death before a Varth dreadnought delivered the final blow that broke her spine and scattered her remains across the void. When the battle finally ended, the silence was absolute. Where 1,800 human ships had fought, only 127 remained, limping toward the edge of the system on damaged engines, carrying the survivors of the greatest betrayal in galactic history. Over 2 million humans had died in a single hour, murdered not by an honest enemy, but by allies they had trusted, friends they had bled beside, species they had called brothers in arms. The surviving ships carried Vasquez's final transmission in their databanks, and they carried something else. A message encoded in her last words that only humans would understand. A reference to something buried deep in Earth's military archives. Something that had not been activated in 300 years. Protocol Prometheus, the contingency plan created in humanity's darkest hour. Designed for a moment when the species faced extinction and normal rules no longer applied. Across the galaxy, on Earth and every human colony, the transmission was received and decoded, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence as 38 billion humans absorbed the news of what had been done to their people. Then, slowly at first, but building like a storm, the response began not with screams of grief or howls of rage, but with something far more frightening: the quiet, methodical sound of a species beginning to prepare. The Valari believed they had eliminated the human threat forever. But they had made a terrible mistake. They had confused humanity's kindness for weakness. their trust for naivety, their mercy for an inability to be merciless. They would learn the truth soon enough, and when they did, the galaxy would never be the same again. 3 months had passed since the massacre at Kethris Prime, and the Valori Grand Council sat in their chamber of crystal and light, congratulating themselves on the success of their brilliant plan. High Counselor Thalos raised a glass of golden wine and smiled at his fellow leaders with the satisfaction of a predator who had eliminated a rival without getting blood on his own claws. "The human problem is solved," he declared, his silver skin gleaming under the artificial sun that lit their meeting hall. "Their fleet is destroyed, their colonies are in chaos, and soon they will fade into irrelevance like so many other aggressive young species before them." The other counselors nodded in agreement. And why would they not? Every report confirmed that humanity was broken beyond repair. Human space had gone silent in the weeks following the battle. Their communications networks had shut down. Their trade ships no longer traveled the space lanes. Their diplomats had abandoned their posts and returned home without a word of explanation. The Krethek war chief, a massive reptilian named Garth, had visited Earth's solar system just 2 weeks ago and reported that the human homeworld appeared to be in complete disarray, with ships moving chaotically between planets and no response to any hailing frequencies. "They are probably fighting among themselves now," Garth had laughed, his yellow eyes bright with cruel amusement. Humans were always too emotional to handle true adversity, and without their military to keep order, they will tear themselves apart. The Concord, what remained of it, had accepted Vorath ambassadors into their space, honoring the secret agreement that had been bought with human blood. The other species said nothing, too afraid of sharing humanity's fate to voice any objection. But not everyone believed the official story of human collapse. Ambassador Kethvon of the Alari had lived on Earth for 15 years before the war, studying human culture and forming friendships that crossed the boundaries of species. He was a small creature by galactic standards, with 4 arms and eyes that saw in spectrums no human could perceive, but his heart was larger than most. He stood before the Valori Council now, having requested an audience that they granted only out of amusement at his concern. "You must listen to me," he pleaded, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into perfect Valori speech. "You do not understand what you have done. The silence from human space is not the silence of defeat. It is the silence of preparation." Thalos laughed, and the sound echoed through the crystal chamber like breaking glass. "Preparation for what, little ambassador? They have no fleet, no resources, no allies, and their population is too small to threaten anyone. 38 billion humans exist across 200 worlds," Kethvon responded. "And you seem to forget that they built their original fleet in just 40 years after first achieving space travel. They are the fastest builders in galactic history, the most adaptable species anyone has ever encountered." "Ancient history," dismissed another counselor. "They built those ships using technology we gave them, without our help. They are nothing." Kethvon shook his head slowly, his 4 arms gesturing in the Ilari expression of despair. "I lived among them. I saw their cities, their factories, their universities filled with young minds burning with curiosity and ambition. And I learned something that you never bothered to discover about the species you condemned." "And what is that?" "Humans do not surrender," the ambassador said quietly. "They do not forgive betrayal. And they have never, not once in their entire blood-soaked history, forgotten a wrong done to them." The council dismissed him with waves of their elegant hands, and Kethvon left knowing that his words had fallen on deaf ears. Meanwhile, in human space, something extraordinary was happening behind the curtain of silence. Every factory on every human world had roared to life in the days following Kethris. Production facilities that had stood dormant since the last Great War were reactivated, their ancient machines restored by engineers who worked without sleep. On Mars, The great shipyards that had built humanity's first interstellar vessels were expanded tenfold, with construction crews working in shifts around the clock, never stopping, never resting, never complaining. On the mining colonies of the asteroid belt, extraction operations increased by a factor of 20, pulling raw materials from the rocks with an urgency that bordered on madness. Children studied harder in schools that now included military history in every curriculum. Elderly scientists came out of retirement to contribute their knowledge. Artists created propaganda that reminded every human of what had been done at Kethris. The names of the dead were read aloud in every city, every town, every village. A litany of loss that took hours to complete, but that everyone listened to in silence. And everywhere, the message was the same. We will not forget. We will not forgive. We will show the galaxy what happens when you betray humanity. Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole stood in the command center of the New Singapore shipyard and watched as another warship slid from the construction dock. The 500th vessel completed this month alone. He was a hard man with gray hair and eyes like frozen steel, and he had lost his wife and daughter at Kethris, their ship. The Un's Mercy had been one of the first destroyed when the Valori opened fire. "How long until we reach full strength?" he asked his aide, a young woman who had lost her entire family in the massacre. 9 months at current production rates, she replied. "We will have 18,000 combat-ready vessels, all equipped with the new weapon systems developed by Project Prometheus." Cole nodded, and something that might have been satisfaction crossed his weathered face. "The galaxy thinks we are broken," he said quietly. "Let them keep thinking that. When we are ready, they will learn the cost of their mistake." 9 months passed in that strange silence, and the Valori grew comfortable in their victory. They integrated Vorath technology into their fleet, expanded their trade networks, and spoke of humans only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting emotional species. Then, on a day that would be remembered for centuries, Valori deep space sensors detected movement at the edge of their territory. A technician stared at his screen in confusion, then called his supervisor, who called his commander, who called the High Council in a panic. "The readings must be wrong," Thylus insisted when he saw the data. No species could build a fleet that size in 9 months, but the readings were not wrong. The human fleet had come, and it was larger than anything the galaxy had ever seen, a tide of metal and fire and righteous fury that stretched across the stars like the wrath of an angry god. The silence was over, and the reckoning had begun. The Valori homeworld of Althris had never known fear for 3,000 years. It had stood as the shining center of galactic civilization, a world of crystal towers and floating gardens where the oldest and wisest species conducted the affairs of 100 star systems. Now, as 18,000 human warships emerged from hyperspace and filled the sky with their terrible presence, the people of Althris learned what fear truly meant. Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole stood on the bridge of the UN's Defiance II, a ship named in honor of Elena Vasquez and built with one purpose: to carry humanity's answer across the stars. He looked at the view screen where the Valori defense fleet was scrambling into formation, 3,400 ships that had seemed so powerful just hours ago, now appearing small and fragile against the wall of human steel. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, "the Valori High Council is requesting to open negotiations. They wish to discuss terms." Cole's expression did not change. He had practiced this moment in his mind 10,000 times, imagining what he would say when the creatures who had murdered his family begged for mercy. "Open a channel to the entire planet," he commanded, "and broadcast to all Concord species. I want everyone in the galaxy to hear this." The channel opened, and Marcus Cole spoke in a voice that carried across light years. "People of the Galactic Concord, this is Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole of the United Nations Space Command 9 months ago. The Valori and Krethek betrayed humanity at the Battle of Kethris Prime, conspiring with our enemies to murder 2 million of our people in cold blood. He paused, letting the words sink in. We did not come here to negotiate. We did not come here to explain ourselves. We came here to deliver a message. And that message is simple. Another pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was ice. Watch. The Battle of Altheris began with a single command, and the human fleet moved as one. A symphony of destruction conducted by officers who had trained for this moment while the galaxy believed them broken. The new weapons developed under Project Prometheus were unlike anything the Valori had ever encountered. Particle beams that cut through shields like paper, missiles that adapted to defensive countermeasures in real time, electronic warfare systems that turned enemy ships against each other. The Valori flagship Eternal Radiance lasted exactly 4 minutes before human plasma torpedoes tore through its ancient hull. Admiral Thalon, cousin to the High Counselor, died never understanding how a species so young could have created weapons so terrifying. Valori commanders screamed orders that their crews could not follow, their communication systems jammed by human electronic warfare, their sensors showing phantom fleets and false readings that made coordinated defense impossible. Concentrate fire on their lead vessels, one captain ordered. But his weapons refused to lock onto the human ships, somehow impossibly. The humans had developed stealth technology that made their massive warships nearly invisible to targeting systems. The human fleet did not fight like the Valori expected. There were no heroic charges, no dramatic maneuvers, no opportunities for the enemy to exploit instead. The humans fought with cold, mathematical precision, each ship knowing exactly where to be and when to fire. 6 hours, that was all it took. When the battle ended, the entire Valori defense fleet had been annihilated. 3,400 ships reduced to expanding clouds of debris that would orbit Altheris for centuries as a memorial to the cost of betrayal. Not a single human vessel was lost. Cole watched the final Valori warship die, then turned to his tactical officer. Begin landing operations, secure the Grand Council building, and take the leadership alive. All of them. And the civilian population, Admiral? Leave them untouched. We are not here to slaughter innocents, only to collect those who gave the orders. Human Marines landed on Altheris in precise formations, moving through the crystal streets with weapons ready but discipline absolute. Civilians who fled were ignored. Those who surrendered were treated with respect, but those who resisted were dealt with swiftly and without mercy. The Grand Council was found hiding in their underground bunker. 12 ancient Valori who had ruled their species for centuries and who now cower before human soldiers young enough to be their great-great-grandchildren. High Counselor Phyllis looked up at the Marine sergeant who stood over him, and his silver face twisted with desperate hope. "We can make a deal," he pleaded. "Credits, technology, territory, name your price, and we will pay it." The sergeant, a woman from the colony of New Helsinki who had lost 3 brothers at Kethris, looked down at him with eyes empty of everything except cold satisfaction. "You already paid the price," she said. "Now you pay the cost." 2 weeks later, the human fleet arrived at the Kreth-Ak homeworld, and the result was the same: their warrior culture, their pride in strength and combat, meant nothing against human weapons and human fury. The Krethathi fought harder than the Valori, but they died just as quickly. Their war chiefs were captured, their fleets were destroyed, and their people were left intact but stripped of their military power. The Varath Dominion, seeing what had happened to their co-conspirators, attempted to flee to the Galactic Rim, abandoning their conquered territories in a desperate bid to escape human vengeance. They did not escape. Human ships, faster and more numerous than anything the Varath had imagined possible, hunted them across the galaxy, destroying their fleets piece by piece until nothing remained but scattered refugees, begging for mercy they had never shown to others. When it was over, Admiral Cole broadcast one final message to the Galactic Concord. Humanity did not want this war. We joined your alliance in good faith. We fought beside you against a common enemy. We gave our blood and our lives for a cause we believed in. His voice carried the weight of 2 million dead, the grief of 38 billion survivors, and the terrible resolve of a species that had been pushed beyond all limits. You betrayed us, and now you have seen the consequences. Let this be a lesson that echoes through history for as long as there are stars in the sky. Humanity does not forget. Humanity does not forgive, and humanity will never again be anyone's sacrifice. The transmission ended, and the galaxy sat in stunned silence. They had thought humans were weak because they were young. They had thought humans were foolish because they were emotional. They had thought humans were easy prey because they trusted too easily. Now they knew the truth. The humans had trusted because they chose to, not because they had to. And when that trust was broken, they had the strength to make the galaxy itself tremble. The reckoning was complete, but the story was not over, for now came the question that would determine the future. What would humanity do with the power they had claimed? The answer would surprise everyone, including the humans themselves. 1 year had passed since the reckoning, and the galaxy had transformed in ways that no species could have predicted. The Varath Dominion was gone, not destroyed, but dismantled, their military disbanded. Their leaders tried for war crimes before tribunals, where victims from a dozen species spoke of atrocities that had continued for centuries until humanity put an end to them. The Varath people themselves were not punished. Human governors arrived to rebuild their shattered worlds, bringing food and medicine, and teachers who showed the children that there were other ways to live besides conquest and cruelty. On a barren moon at the edge of known space, a prison facility held the architects of the Kethris betrayal. High Counselor Thalis of the Valori and War Chief Gorth of the Kreth-Ak sat in adjacent cells, kept alive not out of mercy but out of deliberate design. Why do they not simply kill us? Garth had asked when he first arrived, his warrior spirit unable to comprehend this fate a human. Guard had smiled without warmth and answered, because death would be too quick. You will spend the rest of your long lives watching your empires diminish, watching species you once dominated flourish under human protection, watching everything you built crumble while you sit here unable to do anything but remember what you did. It was a punishment more terrible than execution, and both prisoners knew it. The Galactic Concord no longer existed in its place. Humanity had established the Terran Covenant, a new alliance built on foundations of absolute equality and protected by the largest military force the galaxy had ever seen. But the Covenant was not an empire. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had liberated it, removing the corrupt Valori leadership that had controlled interstellar politics for millennia and giving every species a voice in their own future. The Ilari, the Mothuri, the Delvons, and a dozen other species who had never been part of the betrayal were welcomed as full members. Their representatives sat on councils where human admirals asked their opinions and actually listened to the answers. Ambassador Kethfon of the Ilari, the small creature who had tried to warn the Valori and been ignored, became the first alien to be granted honorary human citizenship. He wept during the ceremony, his forearms trembling as the medal was placed around his neck. I do not deserve this honor, he had said. I failed to stop what happened. Admiral Cole, standing beside him, shook his head. You tried to save us when no one else would. That makes you more human than most humans. The other species watched humanity with a mixture of awe and fear, waiting for the inevitable moment when the humans would reveal themselves as conquerors, no different from the Varath. That moment never came. Human ships patrolled the space lanes, but they did not demand tribute. Human soldiers maintained peace on troubled worlds, but they did not occupy them. Human technology was shared freely with any species that asked, with no strings attached. Why? The new Valori speaker asked during a diplomatic meeting, genuinely confused. You have the power to take everything. Why do you not use it? The human ambassador, a young woman whose grandfather had died at Kethris, looked at him with eyes that held sorrow rather than hatred. Because we are not you, she said simply. We never wanted to rule the galaxy. We only wanted to be treated as equals, as partners, as friends, and when you refused to give us that, we had to take the power to protect ourselves. She paused and looked out the window at the stars that humanity now guarded. But power is not the same as purpose. We fought because we had to. We won because we refused to lose. And now we choose to build rather than destroy, because that is who we have always been. A century passed, and the events of Kethris became history, then legend. Then finally a lesson taught in schools across the galaxy. A young Valori historian named Cirith spent her life studying that era, trying to understand how her ancestors had made such a catastrophic mistake. She traveled to Earth, lived among humans for years, and formed friendships that her grandparents would have considered impossible. One evening, she sat with her human colleague, a professor of Xena history named James, and asked the question that had haunted her for decades. You had every right to destroy us, she said quietly. After what we did, after Kethris, no one would have blamed you if you had burned our worlds and ended our civilization forever. Why did you not do it? James was silent for a long moment, looking at the sunset over the Pacific Ocean with eyes that held memories of stories passed down through generations. Because that was what you expected us to do, he finally answered. And we realized that becoming what you feared would have been the ultimate betrayal, not of you, but of ourselves. He turned to look at her, and his smile was sad but genuine. We are not monsters, Cirith, we never were. Even when you tried to make us into one, and we needed the galaxy to understand something important. What is that? That you can break our ships and kill our people and burn our worlds. But the moment you betray us, you do not get to be our enemy anymore. You become our lesson. Cirith did not fully understand until years later, when she met a Vorath child named Kaya in a school on what had once been a conquered world. Kaya was studying human history, learning about Earth's past, their wars, their genocides, their centuries of cruelty to each other and to their own planet. All the darkness that had once made humanity seem so dangerous. But she was also learning about what came after, the slow, painful process of growth that had transformed a species of warring tribes into explorers who reached for the stars. They survived themselves, Kaya said with wonder in her young eyes. They made all the same mistakes we did, but they did not stay broken. They changed. Cirith nodded, finally understanding the truth that had eluded her for so long. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had adopted it, the way a parent adopts a troubled child, with patience and firmness and an absolute refusal to give up even when it would have been easier to walk away. The stars no longer seemed cold and hostile when Cirith looked at them. Instead, they seemed full of possibility, of hope, of the promise that even the worst mistakes could be overcome if you were willing to try. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy, not their ships or their weapons or their terrible capacity for vengeance, but their stubborn, irrational belief that tomorrow could always be better than today. And in the end, that belief proved more powerful than any fleet ever built.